Hi everybody, thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of the books of Ray Comfort. In this video I will begin looking at book 2 in this series, which is Ray Comfort's God Doesn't Believe in Atheists. I'll be covering the first 4 chapters of the book in this video. The chapters are a lot shorter in this book than they were in the previous book we just finished looking at. You can lead an atheist to evidence, but you can't make him think. But before I get to the chapters, I want to talk about the foreword, because this is one of those books that has a foreword and an introduction. The foreword of this book, God Doesn't Believe in Atheists, was written by none other than Kent Hovind, who lists his location at the bottom of the page underneath his name in this foreword as Pensacola, Florida. So we know that he wrote this prior to his present incarceration in a federal prison in Georgia for not paying his taxes. This book, by the way, was originally published. The first edition was published in, I think, 1993. The updated edition, which is what I'm basing my review on, was published in 2002. So that's how old this book is. In his foreword, Hovind says very little of note. He just quickly rehashes his usual shtick that the universe is clearly designed, so it must have a designer, that atheism and evolution are just other forms of religion, etc., which is also pretty much Ray Comfort's shtick, so you can see why Hovind got the gig to write the foreword. And then Hovind declares, quote, Ray Comfort's goal in this book is to bring the atheist face to face with the facts and make him realize that the very God he claims not to believe in loves him anyway and wants to forgive his sin. It is my hope and prayer that this book will help every open-minded atheist come to know the creator of the universe as his personal savior. Again, that is Kent Hovind, writing in the foreword to God Doesn't Believe in Atheists. Ever since I started doing these series on apologetics books, I have strongly suspected that the target audience for most, if not all, apologists is not non-believers, but rather insecure believers who are looking for a reassuring pat on the head. And yet most apologists claim to be directing themselves to the atheists. And this dishonesty is fundamental to the way that Christian apologetics is presented. Kent Hovind and Ray Comfort himself and many other apologists of the same type claim to be talking to atheists. And yet this book has a page in it right before the foreword that defines the word atheism as one who denies the existence of God. A foreword written by fucking Dr. Dino, who has made a career out of misrepresenting the theory of evolution and the evidence for it. And numerous other features suggest that this book wasn't written for atheists, nor was it written by someone who understands or is particularly interested in understanding atheism. Atheists, or rather the atheist straw men that Ray Comfort has constructed for his purposes, are the foils here, not the target audience. The real target audience consists of those Christians who have experienced doubts in their faith and have either sought reassurance on their own or let word of their uncertainty slip out within earshot of a relative or a friend from church and had this book placed in their hands. Following the foreword, there is an introduction written by Ray Comfort himself where he says nothing worth mentioning. So let's go ahead and jump straight to Chapter 1, Who Made God? Ray begins by saying that it amazes him how anyone can believe in God yet not recognize that there is something wrong in the world. And then he rattles off a series of depressing statistics. 20,000 children starve to death every day. Thousands die every year from snake bites. Dozens die from shark attacks, and many more from infectious diseases carried by insects. Millions die of cancer, heart disease, and other ailments. Natural disasters can threaten virtually anyone at any time. People are struck by lightning or killed in hurricanes or have their lives ended or at the very least ruined terribly by volcanic eruptions or earthquakes. And Ray says, quote, the fact is there are only 3 alternatives to explain all this suffering. 1, there is no God, as evidenced by the chaos. 2, God is totally incompetent and can't control his creation, or won't, which makes him a tyrant. 3, there is another explanation, one which the Bible gives for the state of the world. Or 4, there is another explanation having to do with a religion other than Christianity, found in a holy book other than the Bible. Ray, as we saw in the previous book, likes to pretend, for the most part, that Christianity is the only religion, or at least that it is unique among religions. Remember, he doesn't like to have the term religion or religious applied to him. He finds it very, very insulting. And that if we're going to entertain a religious explanation for something, we should only consider the Bible. But it doesn't work that way. If we're going to consider that the Bible might be able to explain things like disease or natural disaster or random destruction and make sense of those in some sort of moral context, then it's only fair that we also consider what, if anything, the Quran and the Talmud and the Book of Mormon and the Vedas and the I Ching and the scriptures of any other faith that we might be able to think of have to say on the subject. If there was evidence that the Bible contained some unique, divinely inspired insights that those other holy books lacked, then it would be a different matter and perhaps closer to how Ray thinks it should be. But unfortunately for him, there is no such evidence. Ray examines those 3 possibilities, starting with the first one, which he calls the basis of atheism. New chapter section entitled Faith is for Wimps. Ray immediately attempts to confuse religious faith with other types of faith. For instance, he says that we don't have first-hand knowledge about things like historical events or countries we have never visited or scientific facts that we don't have the expertise to test ourselves, and we just accept that those things happened or exist or are true on faith. Without faith, we descend into paranoia. Ray says, quote, "If then faith so evidently surrounds us, why should it be so offensive? It is simply because faith is as essential to the spiritual realm as oxygen is to the natural realm. The professing atheist thinks that if he can get rid of any thought of faith, he can get rid of Christianity. In trying to do so, he saws through the branch he is sitting on. His own faith and the erroneous information he has makes him think he is atheistic in his beliefs." I think Ray meant to say that oxygen is essential to us in the natural realm. Oxygen is not essential to the existence of the natural realm as a whole at all. If the oxygen all disappeared somehow, the universe would keep humming along just fine. It would fuck up some shit here or there, but it's not like oxygen is an essential element to universal existence, so far as we know. Anyway, faith in the religious sense is intellectually offensive to many of us because it's not actually based on anything other than unsubstantiated assertions and wishful thinking. There's a big difference between that and having faith or trust that the conclusion you've drawn based on evidence or experience is accurate. The constant effort on the part of apologists to make people forget about that big difference is something else that is intellectually offensive to many of us who know better, while I'm on the subject of shit that's offensive. Next section, trump card. Ray turns to the question, which is posed in the title of this chapter, of who made God. He says that most atheists, in his experience, treat this question as their trump card. But in reality, the explanation is very simple. And that explanation is that we are trapped in linear time. We are existing in the dimension of linear time, which causes us to insist that things have beginnings and ends, because that has been our experience. But since God exists outside of time, and in fact created time, he is not subject to the same rules that we are subject to. According to the Bible, one day we will be free of the dimension of time as well, and we will dwell with God in eternity. In other words, God is eternal and unlimited. He was not created by anything. He has always existed, and he always will. And that is the usual answer when apologists are confronted with the prospect of an infinite regress, when they insist that something as grand and complex as the universe must have been created by an even grander and more complex creator. Well, only things that have a beginning need to have a cause, and since God had no beginning, He needs no cause. That's how it usually goes. And that argument functions well enough as a philosophical escape hatch, I suppose. But there's still the question of why anyone should believe that this eternal God actually exists at all, let alone is as the Bible, as interpreted by Ray Comfort, describes him. And while the eternal God might prevent the problem of an infinite regress in terms of causation, it doesn't solve the problem of multiplying assumptions beyond necessity, which Occam's razor quite reasonably advises us to avoid. Why is it better to assume that the universe was made by a God who didn't need making than to simply assume that the universe itself, in some sense, didn't need making? Next section, this will be a good one, the atheist test. Ray says he doesn't believe in atheists, because even though there are those who profess to be atheists, genuine atheists cannot actually exist. The atheist test consists of 2 questions. Those questions are, do you know the combined weight of all the sand on all the beaches of Hawaii? And do you know how many hairs are on the back of a fully grown male Tibetan yak? Both questions are designed to remind the person being questioned that he or she doesn't know everything. And then Ray says, quote, let's say that you have an incredible 1% of all the knowledge in the universe. Would it be possible in the 99% of the knowledge that you haven't yet come across that there might be ample evidence to prove the existence of God? If you are reasonable, you will be forced to admit that it is possible. Do you see where this is going? Well, Ray makes it crystal clear a couple of paragraphs later, just in case you can't see where this is going. Quote, to say categorically there is no God is to make an absurd statement. For the statement to be true, I must know for certain that there is no God in the entire universe. No human being has all knowledge. Therefore, none of us is able to truthfully make this assertion. If you insist upon disbelief in God, what you must say is, having the limited knowledge I have at present, I believe that there is no God. And that essentially is what most atheists do say. Ray's denial of the existence of atheists comes down to a disagreement over the definition of the word. Most atheists, including myself, choose to define atheism as either the belief in the non-existence of gods or the lack of belief in the existence of gods. There is no claim in either statement of atheism to absolute knowledge. There is no requirement of possessing absolute knowledge to honestly hold either belief or lack of belief. For most atheists, there isn't even the feeling of total certainty. It's a conclusion based on the evidence, or rather the lack of evidence, and the fact that the existence of God is an unnecessary assumption that has no explanatory value. If Ray Comfort is truly as interested in engaging with and winning over atheists as he claims he is, and I don't think he is, but he says he is, then wouldn't it make much more sense to simply come to accept and understand the term atheist as it is understood and used by most actual atheists, rather than to use a less accepted definition as the basis of an obnoxious, you know you're not really atheists argument? I've noticed that Ray claims the right to define the term Christian to suit his own narrow purposes and to determine who is genuinely Christian and who isn't. So in light of that, I don't think I'm expecting so much. Moving on now to Chapter 2, Banana in Hand. Oh baby, this is it. The origin of Banana Man. Ray Comfort is about to prove that God exists using the Coca-Cola can and the banana. First, Ray tries to illustrate the absurdity of a godless, naturalistic universe shaped by undirected physical laws by postulating that a Coke can is the result not of human design and manufacturing, but of billions of years of cosmic evolution. Obviously, this is nonsense, since a Coke can bears the clear marks of being designed. It didn't just happen by accident. Quote, "Now, to help me bring what I am saying to a point, I would appreciate it if you would be kind enough to go find a banana. It will be worth your time and effort." Okay. Exhibit A. Ray describes how well designed the banana is, how it fits neatly into the palm of the human hand, how its color is an indication of whether or not it's fit to be eaten, how, like the Coke can, it has a tab that you can pull to easily open it. Oh man, you can just tell that while he was writing this, he thought it was solid gold. Finally, the banana not only tastes good, but it's good for your body, packed with nutrients, and easily digestible. Well, I mean, the taste thing is a matter of opinion. I've never actually cared for the taste of bananas myself. Exhibit B. Next, Ray says to put the banana down and go grab an apple. God damn it. Okay. As with the banana, Ray describes how the form of the apple makes it ideally suited for humans. It's shaped to fit in the palm of the human hand like the banana. Like the banana, it is delicious and filled with nutrients that are good for our body, and it even includes seeds so that we can grow our own apple tree when we're done eating it and make more apples. Ray's point is that the banana and the apple are examples of ways in which nature has been designed for the benefit of humanity. And he's right. Of course, the banana is the product of intelligent design. Of course, unfortunately for Ray's purpose here, the designer of the banana is not God, but people. The banana, even this banana right here that I am holding in my hands at this very moment, is not the product of divine creation. It's the product of thousands of years of human cultivation and selective breeding. And in fact, so is this apple. These are both domesticated fruits, but the banana is a much more interesting example due to its being an excellent illustration of the profound power of selection to shape organisms across many generations. Have you ever seen a wild banana? I don't have one with me here, obviously, but it looks a lot different than this. It's much smaller. If you were to open it, it would be much tougher inside, filled with little rock-like seeds. If it's not ripe enough, it's very sticky. It's basically inedible. Domesticated varieties of banana like this one are great everyday examples of the process of evolution. They are examples of evolution at work. Of course, the evolution of the banana was shaped by artificial selection, not natural selection, but the general idea is the same. Individuals with advantageous traits get to pass on their genes more often than individuals without those advantageous traits, and over many generations, such traits accumulate and take hold within a population and become common, and gradually, continuously, the species changes. It evolves. Since we know for a fact that breeding influenced by artificial selection is capable of producing this from its wild banana ancestors given just a few thousand years, why is it so difficult for Ray Comfort to accept that breeding influenced by natural selection can bring about even more amazing diversity given a few billion years? Well, anyway, I'll have this for a snack later. And I guess I'll give this to my wife. Okay, new section, a matter of faith. Ray insists that the existence of God is not a matter of faith. We can know for certain that God exists in the same way that we know a building must have had a builder. Quote, "When I look at creation, how can I know that there was a creator? I can't see him, hear him, touch him, taste him, or smell him. How can I know that he exists? why creation proves, beyond the shadow of the smallest doubt, that there is a creator. No. For one thing, Ray is assuming that the universe is a creation like Mount Rushmore is a creation. And in fact, many people, including Dr. Dino himself, Kent Hovind, have used that example of Mount Rushmore. A product of intelligence and intention. When I think a better analogy for what Ray Comfort calls creation is probably something like the Badlands Guardian Rock Formation in Alberta, Canada, the Indian head, that if you look at it from an overhead view, it looks very much like a portrait, a sideways view of a human head with an Indian feather headdress. It's a completely natural phenomenon. It's a product of natural forces that roughly resembles a designed object, but is not a designed object. I would argue that is a much better way of thinking about the world and the universe. For another thing, though, and I hate to be a dick about this, but Ray made such a point earlier about how faith was an inescapable part of our lives that I'm afraid I really must insist. If Ray can argue that I can't know for sure that God doesn't exist because the evidence establishing his existence might be somewhere in the 99% of the universe I know nothing about, then I can argue that Ray can't know for sure that God does exist for the exact same reason. Ray might say that his argument isn't empirical but logical, since he's saying the building necessarily implies the builder. But I say, how does Ray know that somewhere in that remaining 99% of the universe, there isn't evidence demonstrating how buildings might exist without having needed builders to get there? That assumption that a building must have a builder is derived from our experience. Ray even poses the question with that assumption. Have you ever seen a building that didn't have a builder, he asks, or a painting that didn't have a painter? Just because we can't imagine how a building could have gotten there without a builder doesn't mean that there is no possible way. I'm not omniscient, and neither is Ray Comfort, and unless you're omniscient, uncertainty, doubt, even about something as important as Ray considers his God to be, is just something you are stuck with. It doesn't mean you can't know things. It doesn't mean you can't come to reliable conclusions. You can't rely on deduction or even induction. That's not what I'm saying. It just means that you can't be 100% sure. And you should always be open to new evidence that can cause you to change your mind. And that's not a weakness. That's a fundamental part of the nature of our existence. Let me make it clear that I'm not saying it's reasonable to deny that a painting had a painter or that a building had a builder. I'm just saying, by Ray Comfort's previously described logic, you can't treat it as a 100% certain conclusion, as he treats the existence of God from seeing creation. Next section, what about science? Ray says that science doesn't support atheism, but theism, since his buildings need builders argument is scientific. Ray, are you sure you want to go down this road, buddy? It's one thing to say that buildings need builders is a logical argument, though even if I accepted it, it still wouldn't get me to total certainty about the existence of God for reasons that I just discussed. It's another thing to say that buildings need builders is science, because science is empirical. The scientific method demands that we put our biases aside as much as possible and subject the phenomena we wish to explain to honest and ruthless examination. Under the bright light of such a scientific examination, Ray's situation is revealed to be even worse than not being able to say with 100% certainty that all buildings must have builders. Ray's building is the result of unconscious natural processes and isn't actually a building at all. Moving on now to chapter 3 of the book, which is entitled Seeing is Believing. And Ray begins chapter 3 with the following philosophical gem. Quote, "The existence of God is what's known as an axiom, a self-evident truth." And then Ray restates the building-builder or creation-creator argument, insisting that because of this, The existence of God should need to be neither proven nor disproven. It's just self-evident. Now, those of you who have watched me do these series in the past, and especially those of you who are well-versed in philosophy, have no doubt noticed that I am not well-versed in philosophy, at least not formally. But I do recognize bad philosophy when I see it. And here's the problem I have with what Ray Comfort is saying about the existence of God being a self-evident truth. When philosophers talk of self-evident truths, and the existence of self-evident propositions is not universally accepted among philosophers, by the way. There are those who insist that there can be no such thing as a truly self-evident proposition. But when they talk about things like that, they typically mean something like the law of non-contradiction, which states that contradictory propositions cannot both be true in the same sense at the same time. Or maybe the law of identity, which states that everything is the same as itself and different from that which is not itself. In other words, A is A is not A. Those are what they talk about when they talk about self-evident truths or self-evident propositions. The existence of God, on the other hand, and just in the most generic sense, not even considering the specific personal God of the Bible proposed by Ray Comfort, is not such a proposition. One common way of defining a self-evident proposition is to say that the denial of such a proposition would be self-contradictory. For instance, if I say A is A and A is not A, you can't deny that without making a self-contradictory statement. A is not A doesn't make any sense. But there's nothing self-contradictory about the statement God does not exist. Much less the statement, based on the evidence as I understand it, I conclude that God most likely does not exist, which is, I think, more typical of something that an atheist would say. It's certainly something more typical of what I would say about my own atheism. Ray says that the existence of his God is self-evident because it eases his burden of proof, he thinks, and because it packs a rhetorical wallop. After all, how deluded and foolish must an atheist be to deny the existence of God when it's self-evident? That's the upside of calling God's existence self-evident. The downside, which Ray doesn't seem to have considered, is that insisting a proposition to be self-evident when it obviously isn't only makes you look like an idiot and kind of a jerk. Next section, back to Da Vinci. Ray restates the buildings need builders, painters do paintings argument, yet again, arguing that the mere existence of the painting requires the existence of the painter, and we know the painter was there whether we saw him ourselves or not. Ray also reminds us that we don't have the power ourselves to make something from nothing, which is totally irrelevant. The fact that we lack an ability is not evidence that Ray's God possesses that ability or exists in the first place. Next section is titled Albert Knew. Ray asks us to meditate on the precision of nature, the turning of the seasons, the predictable motions of the sun, the moon's influence on the tides. He should maybe send a note about that to Bill O'Reilly. Plants taking in carbon dioxide and giving off oxygen, while we breathe in oxygen and give off carbon dioxide. And then he abruptly changes the subject to things which exist even though we can't see them. And he says, quote, "If you can't believe in things that you've never seen, how then do you know you have a brain? You've never seen it. If you can look at this miraculous creation and insist that there's no creator, then you'd also have to say there's no evidence that your brain exists. The fact that I know I don't have to say that is evidence that I do have a brain and that it's functioning more or less correctly, I would argue. I'll give Ray this much. He's determined. It takes a certain kind of relentless, terrible determination to just keep making the exact same argument over and over and over and over again. Speaking of repetition, next Ray repeats himself, not from this book, but from the previous book that we studied in this series, You Can Lead an Atheist to Evidence, but you can't make him think. First, he quote mines Albert Einstein to imply that Einstein believed in a personal God. He didn't. Then he quote mines Stephen Hawking to imply that Hawking believes in a personal God. He doesn't. And in fact, Ray quote mines Hawking in exactly the same way, using exactly the same out-of-context quote that he did in You Can Lead an Atheist to Evidence. And actually, this book was published first, which means that technically he was repeating himself in You Can Lead an Atheist to Evidence. Although it wouldn't shock me to learn that this isn't the first time that he quote mines Stephen Hawking either, since he seems to be so goddamn fond of doing it. Ray then proceeds to his own half-assed argument from design, which we saw a little bit of in Book 1, writing about the awesomeness of the sun and how the Earth is just the right distance to allow for life to flourish. He says, quote, "What sort of creative force could make that sun and then hold it in space and sustain its brilliance? Take a moment to meditate on that thought." I'm not sure what Ray means by hold it in space. The sun isn't stationary. It's constantly in motion, orbiting the center of our galaxy, just the same as the objects in the solar system orbit the sun. Or does he mean hold it as in hold it up? Like, without God, the sun would fall down. But fall where? It's in fucking outer space. Anyway, Ray continues pondering the greatness of the creative force of the universe. He says, quote, "How could it create the human mind with its unending complex corridors, its deepest thoughts and desires? The brain is utterly incredible. It makes you think, doesn't it?" Oh, the brain does make you think, Ray. Very clever. The problem, puns aside, is that Ray doesn't want us to think. He's not pondering the mysteries of the universe, the unanswerable questions of existence. He's saying that he has the answer. More than that, he's implying that your presumed lack of an answer is evidence for the truth of his proposed answer. And it just doesn't work that way. Ignorance is not evidence. Incredulity is not evidence. Yes, the brain is an incredibly complex organ. Yes, the sun is a beautiful and magnificent thing. And it's very fortunate for us and for the rest of life on this planet that Earth's position relative to the sun is what it is and has been for the last few billion years. It does make you think. Even with some knowledge of biology and cosmology, it can be overwhelming. The complexity, the precision, the tenuous nature of our existence. I can only imagine how even more unfathomable these things must seem to someone like Ray Comfort, who obviously knows fuck all about biology and cosmology and lots and lots and lots of other things. But how unfathomable you find the universe is irrelevant. Your incredulity at how amazing everything is, and your awe when pondering where it all must have come from, doesn't make God, Ray Comfort's, or anyone else's even the slightest bit more likely to exist. And now, Chapter 4, Strawberries and Garlic. All right, let's see what this is all about. Ray picks up in this chapter where he just left off in the last one with more awestruck, incredulous questions about nature. Why do we close our eyes when we sneeze? What makes our hair grow? Wouldn't it be weird if our eyelashes grew as long as the hair on our heads? What about snails? How are they able to grow shells in just the proper proportion to their bodies? And how do caterpillars transform themselves into butterflies? Quote, "Perhaps you could mumble evolution and believe that it could happen if millions of years were involved, but all this happens in a few weeks." Well, the changing of a caterpillar into a butterfly isn't evolution, it's metamorphosis. Evolution happens to species across many generations, not to individuals within a single generation. The process of metamorphosis is a result of evolution, like everything else about that animal, but it's not evolution itself. So we shouldn't be amazed that it doesn't take millions of years to happen. Also, if you understand how evolution works, you don't have to mumble evolution in response to questions you don't know the answers to. You can find out the actual answers. Just reflexively mumbling evolution when you don't know would be an appeal to ignorance. I don't know why that happens, so it must be evolution. And that's not the sort of argument evolutionary biologists make for evolution. That's the sort of argument apologists make for God. Next section, evolution and blood. Ray continues his argument from incredulity, turning to blood as an example. Blood is very complex stuff, you know? It requires 12 individual chemical reactions in order for blood to clot. Ray says, quote, "If evolution were true, if this 12-step process didn't happen in the first generation, i.e. if any one of these specific reactions failed to operate in their exact reaction and order, no creatures would have survived. They all would have bled to death." Ray goes on to lay out the concept of irreducible complexity, citing Michael Behe and his book Darwin's Black Box, which is largely responsible for popularizing this idea among creationists and apologists. The problem with the argument that Ray and Behe make is that they assume that the supposedly irreducibly complex process in question is the only way to get its result. Just because the blood clotting process in vertebrate animals requires a precise series of 12 chemical reactions, and this is called the blood clotting cascade, by the way, this is no reason to assume that there are no other processes by which blood can clot. In fact, there are other processes known to science by which blood clots. For instance, lobsters have a different, less complex system for blood clotting. Another problem is the assumption that complex systems could not have evolved in gradual stages because their present function is the only possible source of an advantage to the organism. Again, this isn't a reasonable assumption. The vertebrate blood clotting cascade can be explained by evolution, and so can the clotting system of lobsters, by the way. And the blood clotting cascade has been explained in peer-reviewed scientific papers published prior to the publication of the most recent edition of this book, God Doesn't Believe in Atheists, in 2002. In other words, if Ray had cared about correcting his argument and putting forth the most accurate information, he could have. He just didn't. For another example of irreducible complexity, Ray offers the eye, and this is an even worse example than the blood clotting cascade, because the evolution of the eye is even better understood than that and more comprehensively explained. We know how eyes evolved, and not just our eyes, but the eyes of other organisms that operate a little differently than ours, and in some cases are even better, serve their organisms better than our eyes serve us. There is just no such thing as irreducible complexity. Next section, a statistical monstrosity. The parade of shitty arguments continues as Ray trots out the old saw about how outrageously long the odds of life evolving by chance must have been. Therefore, it only makes sense to assume that God was responsible instead. He cites George Gallup and Fred Hoyle, both of whom considered life resulting from random processes to be absurdly unlikely. Well, a few points on these claims about how statistically unlikely it was for life to evolve without some sort of divine intervention. First, the statistics are meaningless because we have no way of knowing how many possible outcomes there were other than the outcome which actually happened. Second, evolution is not a random process, and the evolution of species isn't something that just happens. It's not an intelligent, intentional process, and genetic mutations appear randomly, but evolution is influenced by natural selection and subject to the same laws of physics and chemistry as every other physical process in the universe. And it takes a very long time. Humans didn't just randomly pop into existence from the genetic soup of the primitive Earth with no intermediate steps. There were countless intermediate steps from the first organisms to the first humans, as well as the first of any other modern organism. And from here, Ray goes right back
to more arguments from incredulity. How is it that our ears are shaped so perfectly to capture sound? What if our noses were upside down? How can cows transform grass into milk? How does that milk then change into butter or cheese? We can't build a machine that makes milk from grass, and yet a cow does, and does it without even thinking about it. How does a sparrow know how to fly with the other sparrows? How can strawberries and garlic grow side by side in the same soil, yet retain their unique tastes? This is the sort of thing I can imagine Plato and Aristotle arguing about during recess in first grade. Philosophy babies. There are actual answers to those questions. But even if there weren't, even if we had no idea how any of that shit that Ray was talking about came to be or worked or anything, it wouldn't matter. Again, ignorance is not evidence. Incredulity is not evidence for the existence of God. What's worse than Ray not knowing the answers to those questions is that he doesn't want to know. He's not interested in the actual answers. It's better for his case if we don't know the answers, because to him that means that we have no choice but to turn to his God. It seems to me that a God as great and ever-present as Ray's God should leave us with enough evidence that we wouldn't have to resort to a diagnosis of exclusion in order to establish his existence, especially if that existence is, as Ray asserted so strongly earlier, self-evident. But then again, what do I know? I'm just a foolish atheist. Well, that's it for Chapter 4. That's it for this video. I will be back in the next video to continue looking at Book 2, God Doesn't Believe in Atheists. I will cover the next 4 chapters of the book. Those would be Chapter 5, Stronger Than the Sex Drive. Oh, Ray, don't talk about the sex drive. Chapter 6, Atheist Obstacles. Chapter 7, Worms Transformed. And Chapter 8, Tombstone Face. I'm as curious as you are. That's it for this video, everybody. Thank you, as always, for watching. Thank you for bearing with me. I'm so happy to hear that this continues to be of interest and of use to so many of you. As always, feel free to leave a comment on this video, ask me a question, clarify a point, argue with me, tell me I was wrong, tell me I was right, tell me I went too far, I didn't go far enough, whatever. I'm always happy to hear from all of you. I love the feedback. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you next time.